Chapter 36 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 36. Read by Cynthia Lyons. The End. A stupor of grief succeeded to Leonard's passionate cries. He became so much depressed, physically as well as mentally, before the end of the day, that Mr. Davis was seriously alarmed for the consequences. He hailed with gladness a proposal made by the Farquhars that the boy should be removed to their house, and placed under the fond care of his mother's friend, who sent her own child to Abermouth the better to devote herself to Leonard. When they told him of this arrangement, he at first refused to go and leave her, but when Mr. Benson said, "She would have wished it, Leonard, do it for her sake," he went away very quietly, not speaking a word, after Mr. Benson had made the voluntary promise that he should see her once again. He neither spoke nor cried for many hours, and all Jemima's delicate wiles were called forth before his heavy heart could find the relief of tears. And then he was so weak, and his pulse so low, that all who loved him feared for his life. Anxiety about him made a sad distraction from the sorrow for the dead. The three old people, who now formed the household in the chapel house, went about slowly and dreamily, each with a dull wonder at their hearts why they, the infirm and worn out, were left, while she was taken in her lovely prime. The third day after Ruth's death, a gentleman came to the door and asked to speak to Mr. Benson. He was very much wrapped up in furs and cloaks, and the upper exposed part of his face was sunk and hollow, like that of one but partially recovered from illness. Mr. and Miss Benson were at Mr. Farquhar's, gone to see Leonard, and poor old Sally had been having a hearty cry over the kitchen fire before answering the door-knock. Her heart was tenderly inclined, just then, towards any one who had the aspect of suffering. So, although her master was out, and she was usually chary of admitting strangers, she proposed to Mr. Donne, for it was he, that he should come in and await Mr. Benson's return in the study. He was glad enough to avail himself of her offer, for he was feeble and nervous, and come on a piece of business which he exceedingly disliked, and about which he felt very awkward. The fire was nearly, if not quite, out, nor did Sally's vigorous blows do much good, although she left the room with an assurance that it would soon burn up. He leant against the chimney-piece, thinking over events, and with a sensation of discomfort, both external and internal, growing and gathering upon him. He almost wondered whether the proposal he meant to make with regard to Leonard could not be better arranged by letter than by an interview. He became very shivery and impatient of the state of indecision to which his bodily weakness had reduced him. Sally opened the door and came in. "Would you like to walk upstairs, sir?" asked she in a trembling voice, for she had learnt who the visitor was from the driver of the fly, who had run up to the house to inquire what was detaining the gentleman that he had brought from the Queen's Hotel, and, knowing that Ruth had caught the fatal fever from her attendance on Mr. Donne, Sally imagined that it was but a piece of sad civility to invite him upstairs to see the poor dead body, which she had laid out and decked for the grave, with such fond care that she had grown strangely proud of its marble beauty. Mr. Donne was glad enough of any proposal of a change from the cold and comfortless room where he had thought uneasy, remorseful thoughts. He fancied that a change of place would banish the train of reflection that was troubling him, but the change he anticipated was to a well-warmed, cheerful sitting-room, with signs of life, and a bright fire therein, and he was on the last flight of stairs, at the door of the room where Ruth lay, before he understood whither Sally was conducting him. He shrank back for an instant, and then a strange sting of curiosity impelled him on. He stood in the humble, low-roofed attic, the window open, and the tops of the distant snow-covered hills filling up the whiteness of the general aspect. He muffled himself up in his cloak, and shuddered, while Sally reverently drew down the sheet, and showed the beautiful, calm, still face, on which the last rapturous smile still lingered, giving an ineffable look of bright serenity. Her arms were crossed over her breast. The wimple-like cap marked the perfect oval of her face, while two braids of the waving auburn hair peeped out of the narrow border, and lay on the delicate cheeks. He was awed into admiration by the wonderful beauty of that dead woman. "How beautiful she is!" said he, beneath his breath. "Do all dead people look so peaceful, so happy?" "Not all," replied Sally, crying. "Few have been as good and as gentle as she was in their lives." She quite shook with her sobbing. Mr Donne was disturbed by her distress. "Come, my good woman, we must all die." He did not know what to say, and was becoming infected by her sorrow. "I am sure you loved her very much, and were very kind to her in her lifetime. You must take this from me to buy yourself some remembrance of her." He had pulled out a sovereign, and really had a kindly desire to console her and reward her in offering it to her. But she took her apron from her eyes as soon as she became aware of what he was doing, and still holding it midway in her hands, she looked at him indignantly before she burst out, "And who are you, that think to pay for my kindness to her by money? And I was not kind to you, my darling," said she, passionately addressing the motionless, serene body. "I was not kind to you. I frabbed you, and plagued you from the first, my lamb. I came and cut off your pretty locks in this very room, I did, and you said never an angry word to me; no, not then, nor many a time after, when I was very sharp and cross to you. No, I was never kind to you, and I do not think the world was kind to you, my darling. But you are gone where the angels are very tender to such as you. You are, my poor wench." She bent down and kissed the lips, from whose marble, unyielding touch Mr Donne recoiled, even in thought. Just then Mr Benson entered the room. He had returned home before his sister, and came upstairs in search of Sally, to whom he wanted to speak on some subject relating to the funeral. He bowed in recognition of Mr Donne, whom he knew as the member for the town, and whose presence impressed him painfully, as his illness had been the proximate cause of Ruth's death. But he tried to check this feeling, as it was no fault of Mr Donne's. Sally stole out of the room to cry at leisure in her kitchen. "I must apologise for being here," said Mr Donne. "I was hardly conscious where your servant was leading me to, when she expressed her wish that I should walk upstairs." "It is a very common idea in this town, that it is a gratification to be asked to take a last look at the dead," replied Mr Benson. "And in this case I am glad to have seen her once more," said Mr Donne. "Poor Ruth!" Mr Benson glanced up at him at the last word. How did he know her name? To him she had only been Mrs Denbigh, but Mr Donne had no idea that he was talking to one unaware of the connexion that had formerly existed between them; and though he would have preferred carrying on the conversation in a warmer room, yet, as Mr Benson was still gazing at her with sad lingering love, he went on: "I did not recognise her when she came to nurse me. I believe I was delirious. My servant, who had known her long ago in Fordham, told me who she was. I cannot tell you how I regret that she should have died in consequence of her love of me." Mr. Benson looked up at him again, a stern light filling his eyes as he did so. He waited impatiently to hear more, either to quench or confirm his suspicions. If she had not been lying there, very still and calm, he would have forced the words out of Mr. Donne by some abrupt question. As it was, he listened silently, his heart quick beating. "I know that money is but a poor compensation, is no remedy for this event, or for my youthful folly." Mr. Benson set his teeth hard together to keep in words little short of a curse. "Indeed, I offered her money to almost any amount before. Do me justice, sir," catching the gleam of indignation on Mr. Benson's face. "I offered to marry her, and provide for the boy, as if he had been legitimate. It's of no use recurring to that time," said he, his voice faltering. "What is done cannot be undone. But I came now to say that I should be glad to leave the boy still under your charge, and that every expense you think it right to incur in his education I will gladly defray, and place a sum of money in trust for him, say £2,000 or more. Fix what you will. Of course, if you decline retaining him, I must find some one else, but the provision for him shall be the same, for my poor Ruth's sake." Mr. Benson did not speak. He could not, till he had gathered some peace from looking at the ineffable repose of the dead. Then, before he answered, he covered up her face, and in his voice there was the stillness of ice. "Leonard is not unprovided for. Those that honoured his mother will take care of him. He shall never touch a penny of your money. Every offer of service you have made, I reject in his name, and in her presence," said he, bending toward the dead. "Men may call such actions as yours youthful follies. There is another name for them with God. Sir, I will follow you downstairs." All the way down, Mr. Benson heard Mr. Donne's voice urging and entreating, but the words he could not recognise for the thoughts that filled his brain, the rapid putting together of events that was going on there. And when Mr. Donne turned at the door to speak again, and repeat his offers of service to Leonard, Mr. Benson made answer, without well knowing whether the answer fitted the question or not. "I thank God, you have no right, legal or otherwise, over the child, and, for her sake, I will spare him the shame of ever hearing your name as his father." He shut the door in Mr. Donne's face. "An ill-bred, puritanical old fellow. He may have the boy, I am sure, for aught I care. I have done my duty, and will get out of this abominable place as soon as I can. I wish my last remembrance of my beautiful Ruth was not mixed up with all these people." Mr. Benson was bitterly oppressed with this interview. It disturbed the peace with which he was beginning to contemplate events. His anger ruffled him, although such anger had been just and such indignation well deserved, and both had been unconsciously present in his heart for years against the unknown seducer, whom he met face to face by the deathbed of Ruth. It gave him a shock which he did not recover from for many days. He was nervously afraid lest Mr. Donne should appear at the funeral, and not all the reasons he alleged to himself against this apprehension put it utterly away from him. Before then, however, he heard casually, for he would allow himself no inquiries, that he had left the town. No, Ruth's funeral passed over in calm and simple solemnity. Her child, her own household, her friend and Mr. Farquhar, quietly walked after the bier, which was borne by some of the poor to whom she had been very kind in her lifetime, and many others stood aloof in the little burying ground, sadly watching that last ceremony. They slowly dispersed, Mr. Benson leading Leonard by the hand, and secretly wondering at his self-restraint. Almost as soon as they had let themselves into the chapel house, a messenger brought a note from Mrs Bradshaw, with a pot of quince marmalade, which, she said to Miss Benson, she thought that Leonard might fancy; and if he did, they were to be sure and let her know, as she had plenty more. Or was there anything else that he would like? She would gladly make him whatever he fancied. Poor Leonard! He lay stretched on the sofa, white and tearless, beyond the power of any such comfort, however kindly offered. But this was only one of the many homely, simple attentions which all came round to him to offer, from Mr Grey, the rector, down to the nameless poor who called at the back door to inquire how it fared with her child. Mr Benson was anxious, according to dissenting custom, to preach an appropriate funeral sermon. It was the last office he could render to her. It should be done well and carefully. Moreover, it was possible that the circumstances of her life, which were known to all, might be made effective in this manner to work conviction of many truths. Accordingly, he made great preparation of thought and paper. He laboured hard, destroying sheet after sheet, his eyes filling with tears between whiles, as he remembered some fresh proof of the humility and sweetness of her life. Oh, that he could do her justice! But words seemed hard and inflexible, and refused to fit themselves to his ideas. He sat late on Saturday, writing. He watched through the night till Sunday morning was far advanced. He had never taken such pains with any sermon, and he was only half satisfied with it after all. Mrs Farquhar had comforted the bitterness of Sally's grief by giving her very handsome mourning. At any rate, she felt oddly proud and exulting when she thought of her new black gown; but when she remembered why she wore it, she scolded herself pretty sharply for her satisfaction, and took to crying afresh with redoubled vigour. She spent the Sunday morning in alternately smoothing down her skirts and adjusting her broad-hemmed collar, or bemoaning the occasion with tearful earnestness. But the sorrow overcame the little quaint vanity of her heart, as she saw troop after troop of humbly dressed mourners pass by into the old chapel. They were very poor, but each had mounted some rusty piece of crape, or some faded black ribbon. The old came halting and slow, the mothers carried their quiet, awestruck babes. And not only these were there, but others, equally unaccustomed to nonconformist worship. Mr Davis, for instance, to whom Sally acted as chaperone, for he sat in the minister's pew as a stranger, and, as she afterwards said, she had a fellow feeling with him, being a churchwoman herself, and dissenters had such awkward ways. However, she had been there before, so she could set him to rights about their fashions. From the pulpit, Mr Benson saw one and all, the well-filled Bradshaw pew, all in deep mourning. Mr Bradshaw conspicuously so. He would have attended the funeral gladly if they would have asked him. The Farquhars, the many strangers, the still more numerous poor, one or two wild-looking outcasts, who stood afar off, but wept silently and continually. Mr Benson's heart grew very full. His voice trembled as he read and prayed, but he steadied it as he opened his sermon, his great last effort in her honour, the labour that he had prayed God to bless to the hearts of many. For an instant the old man looked on all the upturned faces, listening with wet eyes to hear what he could say to interpret that which was in their hearts, dumb and unshaped, of God's doings, as shown in her life. He looked, and as he gazed, a mist came before him, and he could not see his sermon, nor his hearers, but only Ruth, as she had been, stricken low, and crouching from sight, in the upland field by Llandew, like a woeful, hunted creature. And now her life was over, her struggle ended. Sermon and all was forgotten. He sat down, and hid his face in his hands for a minute or so. Then he arose, pale and serene. He put the sermon away, and opened the Bible, and read the 7th chapter of Revelations, beginning at the 9th verse. Before it was finished, most of his hearers were in tears. It came home to them as more appropriate than any sermon could have been. Even Sally, though full of anxiety as to what her fellow churchmen would think of such proceedings, let the sobs come freely as she heard the words. And he said to me, These are they which came out of great tribulation, and have washed their robes, and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore are they before the throne of God, and serve him day and night in his temple, and he that sitteth on the throne shall dwell among them. They shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more, neither shall the sun light on them, nor any heat. For the Lamb which is in the midst of the throne shall feed them, and shall lead them unto living fountains of waters, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. He preaches sermons sometimes, said Sally, nudging Mr. Davis, as they rose from their knees at last. I make no doubt there was as grand a sermon in yon paper book as ever we hear in church. I've heard him pray uncommon fine, quite beyond any but learned folk. Mr. Bradshaw had been anxious to do something to testify his respect for the woman who, if all had entertained his opinions, would have been driven into hopeless sin. Accordingly, he ordered the first stonemason of the town to meet him in the chapel yard on Monday morning, to take measurement and receive directions for a tombstone. They threaded their way among the grassy heaps to where Ruth was buried, in the south corner, beneath the great wych-elm. When they got there, Leonard raised himself up from the new-stirred turf. His face was swollen with weeping, but when he saw Mr. Bradshaw he calmed himself, and checked his sobs, and, as an explanation of being where he was when thus surprised, he could find nothing to say but the simple words, "My mother is dead, sir." His eyes sought those of Mr. Bradshaw with a wild look of agony, as if to find comfort for that great loss in human sympathy, and at the first word, the first touch of Mr. Bradshaw's hand on his shoulder, he burst out afresh. "Come, come, my boy. Mr. Francis, I will see you about this to-morrow. I will call at your house. Let me take you home. My poor fellow! Come, my lad, come." The first time for years that he had entered Mr. Benson's house, he came leading and comforting her son, and for a moment he could not speak to his old friend, for the sympathy which choked up his voice and filled his eyes with tears. End of chapter 36. Ruth was read by Cynthia Lyons, Naperville, Illinois, winter and spring of 2008.